Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal amid the charred remnants of Charlie's pub, Joss stood motionless, a silent specter among the ashes. But there was no trace of panic in her demeanor, no tremble of a sister shaken by the near loss of Christina. Instead, her eyes were hard, vacant, burning not with fear but with the embers of a fury long buried beneath years of loss, betrayal, and silence. She wasn't just watching the aftermath of a tragedy, she had orchestrated it. The fire that consumed Charlie's wasn't born of chaos or the unpredictable vengeance of Sonny's many enemies. It was a calculated strike, a symbolic purge, executed with precision. Joss had given the order, and Vaughn had followed it. What appeared to the city as another chapter in Sonny's violent legacy was in truth the beginning of her quiet rebellion. One fueled by the trauma she had endured, the blood she believed was on Sonny's hands, and the cold clarity that came with years of watching her family fracture beneath the weight of his world. Trained in secrecy by WSB under Brennan's command, Joss had evolved far beyond the impassioned teenager haunted by her brother's death and the shadows Sonny cast over her home. She was no longer a passive bystander to the Corinthos Empire's brutality. She had become a tactician, someone who could weaponize grief, who could shape vengeance into intelligent strategy. The first fire was a rehearsal, a decoy blaze at an abandoned bar on the city's outskirts. No casualties, no real damage, just enough to assess emergency response time, public reaction, and Sonny's countermeasures. It was the second fire, Charlie's, that mattered. It wasn't just a location owned by Sonny. It was a gathering place, a community anchor, a site weighted with emotional and symbolic significance. And it was Christina's haven. Joss had no intention of killing her, but she didn't mourn the near miss either. In her mind, Christina's near-death experience was collateral damage, an unfortunate consequence of a greater good. Christina's survival was not a deterrent but a spark that fanned the flames of Joss's conviction. To her, Christina was merely another victim in a long line of lives either destroyed or disfigured by Sonny's orbit. Morgan hadn't survived it. Michael had hardened because of it. Carly had lost herself in it. Joss would not become its next casualty. She would be the one to end it. With Vaughn's help, she engineered a false narrative that pointed authorities to a fictitious smuggling ring with old ties to Sonny. She planted misleading data trails and forged encrypted messages, ensuring that the blame would trace to Sonny's past enemies rather than to her. Simultaneously, she fed real intelligence on Sonny's financial movements and personal communications into a covert WSB analytics channel, cloaking herself behind layers of firewalls, deception, and controlled chaos. Her work was silent, surgical. No bullets. No bodies. Just doubt, destruction, and disintegration. Exactly how she intended to dismantle him. The scathing remarks she made to Vaughn, declaring that Sonny brings death wherever he goes, weren't emotional outbursts. They were the articulation of her new doctrine. Sonny was no longer a misguided protector, no longer a misunderstood father figure. He was a liability, a contagion that infected everything he touched, and Port Charles would only be safe once his reign was extinguished. That realization had hardened her heart. Once, she had clung to family as her moral compass, forgiven betrayals, rationalized the damage with promises of love and loyalty. But the cost had grown too high. Morgan's death had been the first fracture. Watching Michael descend into cold pragmatism was another. Witnessing Carly sacrifice pieces of her soul to shield Sonny from consequences pushed Joss to the edge. Her role at WSB was her lifeline, a secret identity that allowed her to channel rage into action. She never told Carly. She couldn't. Carly still loved Sonny in ways Joss could no longer comprehend. Instead, Joss used her relationship with Vaughn as both shield and sword. He believed in her. More than that, he loved her. And because of that love, he was willing to walk beside her into a mission that had grown darker than either of them anticipated. Joss was no longer executing a WSB order. She was shaping her own crusade. The near loss of Christina didn't shake her resolve, it reinforced it. She had looked into the fire and seen not destruction, but transformation. A cycle had to be broken. Sunny's influence had to be cut out like a tumor. And if that meant igniting a chain reaction, she was ready to light the fuse. What had begun as an intelligence mission was now a personal war, veiled in protocol but driven by a fury that no training could temper. She saw herself not as an agent, not even as a vigilante, but as a necessary disruption. The first fire cracked the facade. The second tested the city's response. What came next would expose the fractures in Sunny's empire, fractures she intended to split wide open. She knew Jason might catch on. He always saw what others missed. Michael's suspicions were already surfacing. Carly's intuition would eventually lead her to the truth. But Joss didn't fear their discovery. She feared their failure to act. If they chose to protect Sunny despite the chaos he birthed, then they were part of the problem. She would mourn their betrayal, but she would not be deterred by it. As public speculation swirled, with some celebrating her defiance and others fearing her descent into revenge, Joss remained silent. Her next moves would be calculated, not confessional. She was no longer a victim of Sunny's choices. She was an architect of consequence. Her eyes, reflecting the flames still smoldering in the wreckage of Charlie's pub, held no remorse, only focus. Vaughn stood a few feet away, waiting for her signal, his face taut with unspoken questions. But she said nothing. She didn't need to. The fire had spoken for her. The city would never be the same. And neither would she. Beneath the surface of personal pain and long-buried resentment, Joss concealed a far more calculated agenda, one forged not in fleeting anger but in methodical resolve. Her aim was not merely to destroy Sunny through the literal fire that devoured Charlie's pub. Her mission reached deeper, more insidiously, into the very fabric of the empire he had built. She wanted to strip him of his power by turning those closest to him into skeptics, turning allies into adversaries, and casting him as a pariah, not just in the eyes of law enforcement, but in the hearts of those who once defended him without question. The fire was just the first fracture. Her real strategy was psychological warfare, waged with surgical precision on the very pillars of Sunny's loyalty base. She understood that the strongest fortresses fall not from outside invasion, but from the slow erosion of trust within. That was her weapon. Joss knew Sunny's influence didn't merely rest on money or violence, it depended on belief. Belief from people like Anna, who had justified too many of his misdeeds for the sake of expedience. From Jason, who had followed him through years of moral ambiguity. From Dante, torn between his badge and his blood. Joss studied them, dissected the nature of their loyalty, and began to chip away at it. Through anonymous tip-offs, encrypted leaks, and manipulated intelligence, she introduced just enough inconsistency into Sunny's movements to raise questions. A sudden gap in his usual shipping routes. A curious delay in communication. Financial transactions that didn't align. Each piece alone was innocuous. Together, they formed a web of doubt. She knew Jason would be the first to notice, because Jason noticed everything. That was part of her plan. She didn't want to kill Sunny. She wanted to isolate him. She wanted Jason, his most devoted protector, to look at him one day and wonder if he'd been wrong all along. But the deeper Joss pushed, the higher the stakes rose. Michael, always observant yet emotionally torn, began to sense the subtle shifts in her behavior. He couldn't name it outright, but her detachment, her cryptic responses, her sudden silences, none of it aligned with the sister he had known. He had spent a lifetime walking the tightrope between loyalty to Sunny and loyalty to his own fractured moral compass, and Joss's transformation unsettled him. Carly, her mother, also began to feel the weight of the distance that had grown between them. Though they spoke often, there was a chill in Joss's presence, a guardedness that Carly couldn't breach. She dismissed it at first as the emotional fallout from Christina's close call. But in her heart, Carly knew better. Something in her daughter had changed, and it wasn't just grief. It was resolve. Jason, meanwhile, had quietly begun connecting digital breadcrumbs left behind in Joss's careful sabotage. She was good, better than most WSB trainees. But she had underestimated how well Jason knew her. He saw patterns where others saw coincidence. He recognized her coding signature buried deep in altered footage. He noticed timestamps altered by exactly 3 seconds, Joss's old habit when editing videos as a teenager. Bit by bit, Jason's suspicion sharpened into certainty. But even as he unraveled the evidence, he didn't want to believe what it was telling him. Josslyn, the girl he had once sworn to protect as fiercely as his own blood, was orchestrating Sunny's undoing. And if he confronted her, he knew what it would mean, choosing sides in a war he never wanted to fight. The gravity of what she had set in motion began to press in on Joss, but not enough to stop her. Her vision was clear, and her conviction unwavering. Still, she could not control the fallout. Christina, overwhelmed with gratitude toward Marco for saving her life, became more fiercely devoted to Sunny than ever. In public, she defended him loudly. In private, she doubled down on family unity. Her brush with death hadn't frightened her, it had reignited her belief that her father was worth saving. And in doing so, she unknowingly complicated Joss's path even further. Every rallying cry from Christina, every public statement of forgiveness, was like acid on Joss's plans. It reminded the world that Sunny still had daughters who loved him, and that Joss, by contrast, was the one drawing blood from within. Michael found himself trapped in an emotional stalemate. Part of him sensed that Joss was responsible for what had happened, but another part of him refused to believe she could have gone this far. He tried to reason that maybe she had been manipulated, maybe Vaughn had pulled her into something darker than she intended. But those excuses rang hollow. Deep down, Michael knew that Joss had not been manipulated, she had chosen this. If the truth came out, he would have to choose between protecting her or protecting what was left of their family. Either way, someone would be broken beyond repair. Meanwhile, online speculation exploded. Message boards lit up with theories, outrage, and applause. Some fans celebrated Joss's rebellion, calling it an epic reckoning long overdue. Others expressed heartbreak, warning, she'll regret this when she loses everyone. Social media polarized like never before. Hashtag Team Joss trended beside hashtag Save Sunny. But Joss didn't read the headlines. She didn't care about public opinion. Her war was private. Intimate. And if it meant becoming the villain in order to dismantle one, she would bear that burden. Yet beneath the precision, beneath the vengeance, there was still a wound, raw and pulsing. Joss wasn't numb. She was burning. Not with rage anymore, but with something quieter, more dangerous, purpose. She had spent years mourning Morgan, resenting the silence, watching her family rebuild on top of ashes. This time, she wouldn't let the fire die out. She would fan it. Feed it. Until there was nothing left but truth. Or ruin. The tampered satellite images, the spliced surveillance footage, the doctored logs and misleading data streams uploaded into WSB's classified database, each element of the operation bore the imprint of a mind that had long since stepped out of the shadows of innocence. Joss was no longer the bright, broken teenager the world once tried to shield. She had become something else entirely, a force shaped by loss, sharpened by grief, and fueled by an unrelenting hunger for justice. What had begun as a quiet wound had calcified into a singular mission, to dismantle Sunny's empire, not by bullets or explosions alone, but by eroding the very foundation upon which his world had been built. The trust of his allies. The fear of his enemies. The illusion of invincibility. Joss sought to annihilate not the man, but the myth. And she was winning. Every falsified report was handcrafted. She knew exactly how WSB analysts worked, how their systems flagged anomalies, how they responded to patterns. She didn't flood their database with anything dramatic. Instead, she sowed doubt, breadcrumbs meticulously placed to suggest something was off, subtly wrong, just enough to tip the balance of faith. Interpol alerts hinting at resurrected smuggling operations. A grainy video supposedly capturing Sunny in conversation with known arms dealers. Altered shipping manifests from Morgan Pacific Holdings rerouted through flagged territories. She didn't need to fabricate a monster, she only needed to remind them of the one Sunny used to be. And when the pieces started aligning, when the suspicion finally took root in minds like Anna's and Dante's, it wouldn't matter if Sunny was innocent this time. Perception would become reality. And Joss understood perception better than anyone. But beneath the cold precision of her tactics, beneath the ice-veined calm that now defined her posture and tone, still beat the wounded heart of a girl who had never found closure. Morgan's death was not a chapter she had turned. It was a fracture that never healed. A night etched into her bones, the moment the call came, the sound of Carly's screams, the stillness of the house when hope finally faded. And Sunny. Sunny, who had promised to protect them, Sunny, who had sworn that family came first, had been nowhere to be found when it mattered most. His enemies, his choices, his life had led to that explosion. And no amount of whispered apologies or soft-spoken guilt could erase that fact. Joss had spent years smiling through it, pretending to forgive, pretending to move forward. But in truth, she had been standing still, trapped in that night, waiting for a justice that never came. So she built her own. Vaughn had seen glimpses of this darkness in her, had sensed that her motivation ran deeper than strategy or duty. And still, he had followed her. Perhaps it was love. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was fear. But as the fire at Charlie's blazed through the screen before them, he asked if it was time to end the operation, to pass control to the sanctioned WSB teams and step away. Joss said nothing. Not because she was unsure, but because she had already moved beyond WSB. What they had started as an intelligence assignment had become a personal war. And wars didn't end when objectives were completed. They ended when the enemy no longer had anything left to defend. She stood in the control center, arms folded, her gaze locked on the live feed of Charlie's crumbling under the weight of flames. The orange glow reflected in her eyes, not with horror or regret, but with the quiet stillness of resolve. She hadn't blinked when she heard Christina had nearly died. She hadn't flinched when the smoke rolled over the rooftop like a tidal wave. Because this wasn't about Christina. It wasn't even about Carly, or Michael, or the city. This was about legacy. Sunny's. And hers. She wasn't destroying him because she hated him, she was destroying him because she loved her brother more than anything, and the world had allowed Sunny to move on while Morgan remained buried. If no one else would carry that weight, Joss would. But the consequences had begun to close in. Michael's texts had become more frequent, more pointed. He noticed her silences, her disappearing acts, the moments where she avoided eye contact just a little too long. Carly had asked her twice that week if she was okay, really okay. And Jason. Jason had started to surface in all the wrong ways. Unspoken tension hung in every room he entered, as if he could feel her presence in the network, see her hand in the data before the system could confirm it. He would find her. She knew that. He was already too close. And when he did, it wouldn't be a confrontation. It would be an ultimatum. He would try to stop her. He would choose Sunny. He always did. Joss wasn't afraid of that. She had already prepared for it. Her final contingency plans didn't involve escape, they involved exposure. If Jason tried to intervene, she would release everything. Not to WSB. Not to the police. To the public. All of it. The recordings. The accounts. The confessions. She would burn not just Sunny's empire, but the shield that protected it, the silence. And in doing so, she knew she would lose Carly, Michael, maybe even herself. But she would win the truth. And that, in her eyes, was the only victory that mattered. The fire at Charlie's was just the opening note in a crescendo of reckoning. It was meant to be seen. Meant to be felt. Because nothing changed until people were afraid. And now, they were. Every whisper in Port Charles had shifted. Every glance toward Sunny was tinged with hesitation. Even those who remained loyal had begun to wonder, what if? Joss had cracked open the narrative. And when the dust settled, she would be the one holding the pen to finish it. So when Vaughn finally broke the silence beside her, asking once more if she was ready to let go, she turned toward the screen and watched the last ember fall. Her voice, when it came, was low but certain. This isn't over. It's only the beginning. And as the smoke from the second fire rose into the night sky, Josslyn knew in her bones, if Port Charles had to burn to be free of sunny Corinthos, she would light every match herself. With precision. With purpose. And without mercy. And so, as the final embers of Charlie's pub smoldered into silence, Joss stood at the edge of the precipice she had spent years building toward. No longer the grieving sister, no longer the daughter lost in the shadow of a man the world refused to hold accountable. She had become something the city never expected and perhaps would never understand, the reckoning. Every fire, every falsified file, every strategic deception was not just an act of vengeance, it was a manifesto written in smoke and ruin. She hadn't merely set Port Charles ablaze to destroy Sunny. She had done it to awaken a city lulled into complacency by decades of fear and complicity. Now, the cracks had formed. The whispers had begun. The alliances Sunny once took for granted were splintering, and trust, a currency once abundant in his empire, was becoming scarce. But Joss knew the most dangerous fires are the ones that start beneath the surface, the ones no one sees until it's too late to contain. She had become that fire. And as Port Charles prepared for whatever came next, unaware of how deeply the rot had spread, Joss watched with the solemn knowledge that empires do not fall from a single blow. They collapse from within, one lie, one betrayal, one spark at a time. And she was that spark, relentless, unforgiving, and ready to reduce the myth of sunny Corinthos to ash.